So before we get started, the way this is gonna work, I'm gonna read a prepared statement. Before I do that, I wanna introduce you to the three people that are sitting up here to my right. On the end, we have the Miller County Prosecutor, Connie Mitchell, C-O-N-N-I-E-M-I-T-C-H-E-L-L, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Next to her, we have Dr. Todd Steffy, T-O-D-D-S-T-E-F-F-Y, and Captain Calvin Seward, C-A-L-V-I-N-S-E-W-A-R-D. Gordon and Karen Alexander were brutally murdered on April 7th, 1981. For decades, TABD detectives have combed through the case files time and again, searching for anything that could lead to the identity of a suspect or bring some resolution to the many lives impacted by this crime. Although 42 years have passed since the slaying, we now have identified a lone suspect in this heinous case. The Alexander family resided at 501 Baden in Texarkana, Arkansas at the time of the crime. Although the house no longer exists, it was there that Weldon Alexander called the police and reported that he had arrived home at around 7:15 a.m. on Wednesday, April 8th, 1981, after working the night shift at Cooper Tire. Weldon reported that as he approached the porch, he noticed both the screen door and the wooden front door were ajar. Upon entering the house, Weldon Alexander claimed he found his son deceased in the kitchen, and he thought his daughter might still be alive on her bed near the living room. Weldon told officers Terry Spearman and Bobby Thomason that he removed a kitchen knife from Karen's body and laid it on a nearby bookshelf before officers arrived at 7:24 a.m. Officer Spearman confirmed Gordon Alexander to be deceased in the kitchen from apparent sharp instrument trauma, and he noted that Karen Alexander, laying face up on a bed in the living room, was still breathing, but suffering from extensive sharp instrument trauma. Karen was transferred to St. Michael Hospital, where she later died from her injuries. Coincidentally, Vera Alexander, the children's mother, had been previously admitted at Wadley Hospital and was there as a mental patient at the time of the homicides. Detectives from Texarkana, Arkansas Police Department spent days, weeks, months, and years pouring through the evidence, identifying witnesses, and following up on every lead in the case. By 1983, Henry Lee Lucas had been arrested and jailed in Williamson County, Texas. Detectives from Texarkana traveled to Williamson County and returned with Lucas. During the interviews, Lucas confessed to the Alexander homicides, but no warrant was issued, and Lucas was not charged because there was not sufficient forensic, physical, or circumstantial evidence to prove his guilt. Decades later, DNA evidence proved that Lucas had lied in many of his confessions, including the Alexander case. Calvin Seward, in his early 30s at the time, had been on the Texarkana, Arkansas police force for 8 years when the homicides occurred. He was then working as a patrolman. Following the murders, Calvin was assigned to the Criminal Investigation Division to follow up on leads and locate persons of interest in the case. Eventually, the leads ran out and the case went cold, but Calvin's resolve to identify the killer remained. In 1986, Officer Seward's CID assignment ended and he was promoted to the rank of sergeant and returned to the patrol division as a patrol shift supervisor. Sergeant Seward later became Captain Seward before retiring from the police department in 2004 after nearly 32 years of service. Following his career at TAPD, Captain Seward worked another 18 years for the Marshals Service and Airport Police. Although in his second retirement, Calvin Seward had one less box to check, and that was to give Gordon and Karen Alexander case another look. In February of 2022, Captain Seward was given full autonomy to reopen the Alexander case and to pursue to its end any lead or evidence he developed. Over the course of the next 18 months, Captain Seward identified, interviewed, and re-interviewed dozens of people named in the original case and many of their associates. He submitted DNA profiles from many of these people to the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, and submitted or resubmitted dozens of articles of evidence and potential evidence to the State Crime Lab for processing. Captain Seward enlisted the help of Dr. Todd Steffi, a well-known forensic criminologist with more than 30 years of experience in the field of forensic science. Together, they reviewed every aspect of the case, and through consultation with Kelly Dixon, a DNA scientist at the Arkansas State Crime Lab, they determined that, given the recent advancements in DNA processing technology, resubmitting evidence last tested in 2012 might prove beneficial. Excuse me. Seward, Steffi, and Dixon began to reprocess essentially anything that could provide new leads. In 2022, DNA was extracted from both victims' fingernails tissue to be used as known samples to be compared to questioned DNA located at the crime scene. A familial relationship in the DNA determined that Weldon Alexander's semen was discovered on Karen Alexander's bedding. With this information and a statement written by Detective Gary Stringer, a lead investigator in the case in 1981 and one of the first detectives to arrive on scene, they learned that Gordon Alexander's body had been cold to the touch upon officer arrival. These new pieces of evidence led the team to a theory that the children were assaulted before the father, Weldon Alexander, left for work around 11 p.m. the previous day. They knew that there was no sign of forced entry into the home, and Weldon Alexander was the last known person to see Gordon and Karen alive just before leaving the house at 11 p.m. Both children were still in the same clothes they had been wearing the previous day. Weldon had been the person to discover their bodies, and the weapon used was considered a weapon of opportunity, a butter knife, likely from the kitchen in the Alexander home. More pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. There was no foreign outside intruder DNA evidence discovered throughout the investigation. The autopsy revealed that Karen Alexander had been vaginally penetrated 48 to 72 hours prior to her death. Trace evidence discovered in the dried blood on Gordon's hands and Karen's body contained fibers, brass, copper, and zinc, all of which were materials used in the construction of tires at Cooper Tire and Rubber. Based on the robust body of physical evidence, Captain Seward and Dr. Steffi prepared a statement of probable cause affidavit, naming the father of the victims, Weldon Alexander, as a probable suspect in the case, and presented this affidavit to the Miller County prosecuting attorney for review. After thorough review of the evidence presented to her, Miller County prosecuting attorney Connie Mitchell asserts that Weldon Alexander is the sole viable suspect in the murders of Gordon and Karen Alexander, and that she believes probable cause exists for the issuance of an arrest warrant for 2 counts of capital murder. Had Weldon Alexander not died in 2014, she would be requesting those warrants today. It is our hope that the friends and remaining family of Gordon and Karen Alexander may find some peace in knowing that the scientific and circumstantial evidence have been revealed sufficient to resolve this 42-year-old case. We wish to express our greatest appreciation to the team of retired Arkansas Police Department Captain Calvert Seward, Dr. Todd Steffi of the Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit, Kelly Dixon of Arkansas State Crime Lab, and so many other detectives, police officers, concerned citizens, and advocacy groups who provided information and assistance in this case. At this time, I'd like to open up questions to the panel that we have up here, the teams who worked on the case. If any of you have them, please one at a time. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Seward, was this a surprise? In your opinion, the findings, were you surprised by them at all?
I'm sorry.
Were you surprised by the findings?
Yes, to be totally honest with you, I was, because we were going on the assumption of the time of death, which we found out later was wrong. And so, but when you put all the pieces together, we had a lot of suspects that we were looking at, but none of them panned out. We run down the lead as far as we could go with it.
Presumably you had interviewed Mr. Alexander.
No, I didn't. I saw him, cause I was a patrol officer. At the time that, they pulled me into CID to work on this case, all we did was run down leads, but I never spoke to Mr. Alexander. I seen him, but I never talked to him. There was numerous pictures and stuff that we saw and with him, but no, I never spoke to Mr. Alexander. Let me back up on that one thing. We answered prowler calls out at that house sometimes, and that was, Vera Alexander there. Seemed like one time, and I can't swear to this, but it seemed like there was one time when he was there, but I can't swear to that.
Did you ever encounter any evidence in the course of the investigation of the sexual assault of Karen?
Did you hear it? Yeah.
No, I did not understand his question.
Can you repeat the question a little louder, please?
Sure. Did you ever find any evidence in the course of the investigation that Karen had been sexually assaulted? Is this something you knew before?
No, this was in the, come from the medical examiner's office, that she had some type of sexual contact within a 6-month period, but also from the hospital, they reported that she had sexual intercourse within 48 to 72 hours before that, and that came from a doctor who's no longer there. I contacted the St. Michael's people, and they looked through their computer records, and actually they were so kind as they went back in and looked at their stored record, but they couldn't find anything pertaining to that.
Are there any next steps? Maybe will there be any sort of posthumous prosecution or any such thing?
Well, obviously, I cannot issue warrants for an individual who's deceased, so unfortunately, there will be no avenue that the prosecutor's office has to take against Mr. Alexander.
What do y'all think the motive was in this? The motive?
Well, I think we all have our theories, but I'll let these guys go, and I'll tell you mine, but I think mine is the same as theirs.
I believe it was, the father was trying to make some type of, or have some type of sexual act with her, and she resisted, and then things got out of hand, and then he's trying to quiet her down, and then their brother heard it, and that's what I believe, that the chain of events just got out of hand.
Dr. Steffi, what are the challenges with working with DNA that's maybe not quite as fresh as, it could be today?
Well, one of the challenges was that from as old as this case was, they didn't do DNA back then. Excuse me. So, the early investigators did, I think, a great job collecting evidence that would give us something to work with 40 years later. Other challenges include DNA degrades over time, makes it more difficult to work with. Sometimes too, you have mixtures that are more difficult to work with, and the more complex the mixture, the more difficult. Sometimes you're working with partial DNA profiles because of degradation. All of those things are factors. One of the big factors in this particular case, in any case this old, that predates DNA testing, is that oftentimes, as is the case here, you start out with no known standards to compare questioned DNA with. So in 2012, when TAPD resubmitted evidence and they did DNA testing, that's when they started getting these DNA profiles. But the question was, whose DNA are we looking at? Is it Karen's, is it Gordon's, or is it someone else's? And so in 2022 is when I came on board with Captain Seward, and we made a plan to extract DNA from, request that DNA be extracted from the fingernail tissues of the victims to use as known standards, known samples, to compare against the questioned DNA. And that was, in my mind, kind of a turning point in this case. Now we could better tell whose DNA it is and whose DNA it isn't.
Was there DNA evidence from the sexual intercourse?
One of the things we consider when we are looking at DNA evidence, we want to know what biological substance is yielding this DNA. Is it hair? Is it saliva? Is it skin cells? Is it blood? Is it semen? Or what exactly it is? And the other thing we consider is, where are we finding it? You can go in anyone's home and find somebody's DNA. And sometimes it's very important as to where that DNA is found. And it's also very important as to what it is that's yielding that DNA. So I think in answer to your question, and to be honest, I've kind of forgotten what you asked. It was about the sexual assault or the...
Yeah, I know it's 42 years ago, but I mean, was DNA collected from the victim or?
So in terms of DNA that may support the indication of a sexual assault, some of the DNA that we were considering was from a semen stain.
But not on Karen's body.
It was, this particular semen stain, as I recall, was on her bed covers where her mortally wounded body was laying.
What is it? Oh, okay.
I was gonna ask, with the advances in technology, how accurate do you feel the results are of this DNA?
Are you asking me this question?
Yes, about,
And so your question is,
about the accuracy, like how,
I'm not sure I'm understanding you on that. Are you
how
asking-
sure are you that you got the right person?
Oh.
Yeah.
I feel very confident. In fact, one of the things that I've always considered, and Ms. Mitchell can speak to this, I'm sure, when I work a case, there's our justice system has different levels of legal certainty, legal proof. On the far left end of the spectrum is mere suspicion. And we have a lot of that in this case. We've had a lot of mere suspicions about a lot of different people. But mere suspicion doesn't give us any legal authority in our system to really do anything. And so when I've worked cases, and I'm sure many of the officers here, we have to reach there's a level of reasonable suspicion, and that gives us the ability to do a little bit in our justice system. And we had a lot of reasonable suspicion. There are other people that Captain Seward reasonably had suspicions of. But the goal is to reach a level of legal certainty that would constitute probable cause, which is the level that's necessary for an arrest in our justice system. Even better than that is if you can reach a level of beyond a reasonable doubt, which prosecutors really prefer, because they're the ones who have to go to court and prosecute the case. And that's what's necessary to get a conviction in a criminal case. And in this particular case, we reached a point, you asked, and to answer your question of how certain I am, Captain Seward and I reached a point that we talked about it and said, not only do I believe we have reached probable cause level, but I believe we've reached beyond a reasonable doubt level, and I think it's time for us to go meet with the prosecutor and get her opinion, because it's not, in the end, it's not really just my opinion that matters or Captain Seward's. And so we went and met with Ms. Mitchell and presented our case.
For Ms. Mitchell and Chief Kramer, is this case considered closed now?
It's not closed till we finally put the file away completely. And so we're comfortable with the prosecutor feeling that it's a lone and viable suspect, that we've completed the investigation, yes. As far as closed, there's always a T to dot and an I to cross before you put a case file away, and that will be coming.
Chief, have you ever seen anything similar to this in your career? Anything so old, solved?
In my past life, when I was at League City, we had a few cold cases. We had a triple homicide the year I graduated high school in 1983 that was not, so we didn't finally make an arrest in until 2020 or so. I think at the time it was like 38 years old. This is the oldest one I've ever seen, or been a part of for sure. Do we have any more questions for the team up here?
Mr. Stewart, I know you put a lot of energy into this, and you must have cared very deeply about the outcome. What are your thoughts now that things are laid to rest?
It is it's really kind of hard to describe the feelings I have because of my daughter went to school with Karen, and seeing those kids and working on it when I first became investigator and not really knowing anything how to investigate, just going through all this and seeing all these things after all this time, it really, there's a lot of stress and just like a load has been taken off my shoulders. I really feel good about it. I'll say this, and I started praying about this thing when I first started on the case, and Dr. Steffi and all of us and Christian people, and we prayed about it and really felt good about it. But I had so much help from everyone here, the police department, everyone just bent over backwards trying to help me and just let me do whatever I felt like I needed to do. And then when I hooked up with Dr. Steffi, which is probably the most brilliant men I've ever met in my life in law enforcement, he just blew me away. He's a genius. And he taught me so much stuff about DNA and it refreshed my time in CID that I spent investigating case. So, but this particular case, there's nothing that feels any better to me to bring it to closure. It's resolved in my mind, so it's a great feeling, and I hope that it brings some closure to a lot of people.
What are you gonna do now?
You may not get to decide, we have other unsolved cases. I'm not trying to be glib, but I would like to say this before we depart. Captain Seward is not a one-off for this area. It's really impressive how dedicated the men and women of this department are and how much they're willing to give and not walk away from. You don't see that every day in every walk of life or any place you go. You don't see customer service the way you used to see it. You don't see the level of dedication that I witness every day here, and it's impressive.